The sound of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Manhattan penthouse matched the storm brewing inside Margaret Chen's chest. She stood in the marble foyer, raindrops still clinging to her designer coat, her hand unconsciously moving to her purse where the pregnancy test lay hidden like a secret weapon she hadn't yet decided to use. "Margaret, you need to pack your things and leave. Tonight." The words hit her like ice water. After 22 years of marriage to billionaire Richard Blackstone, she'd imagined many scenarios for how their relationship might end. This wasn't one of them. Richard stood at the top of their curved staircase, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, his navy suit showing no wrinkles even after what he'd claimed was a 14-hour workday. At 52, he still commanded attention when he walked into boardrooms. Tonight, he commanded nothing but her bewilderment. "Richard, what are you talking about?" Margaret's voice carried the measured tone she'd perfected during 2 decades of charity galas and business dinners. Even in shock, her training held, "I need to tell you something important. I went to the doctor today, and—" "Save it," he interrupted, his voice cold as the October wind rattling their windows. "Jennifer will be moving in tomorrow morning. My attorney will contact you about the divorce proceedings." Jennifer, his 28-year-old secretary with the breathy voice and the habit of calling him Mr. Blackstone even when she thought no one was listening. Margaret had noticed the way Jennifer's skirts had gotten shorter over the past year, the way Richard's business trips had increased, the way he'd started showering immediately when he came home instead of kissing her hello first. "You're divorcing me for your secretary." The question came out smaller than Margaret intended, like air leaking from a balloon. "Richard, we've been together since we were young. You built your empire while you what?" His laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "While you played house, while you ran your little consulting business. Margaret, I need a partner who understands the real world. Someone who can keep up with my lifestyle." Margaret's hand tightened on her purse strap, inside wrapped in tissue paper. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines. At 45, she'd assumed her chance for children had passed. The doctor had called it a miracle. Richard, apparently, would call it something else entirely. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Margaret thought about how different this conversation might have gone if she'd been able to share her news first. If she'd been able to tell him that their family was about to grow, that after years of failed attempts and disappointments, they were finally going to have the baby they dreamed about when they were young and still believed they could conquer the world together. 22 years, and she whispered, more to herself than to him. 22 years of what? Margaret. 22 years of charity luncheons and book clubs. I need someone who can contribute to my success, not just benefit from it. The cruelty in his voice was new. In all their years together, through business stresses and family deaths and the quiet disappointments of a childless marriage, Richard had never spoken to her with such calculated coldness. This wasn't the passionate anger of a fight. This was the efficient dismissal of an employee who'd outlived their usefulness. Margaret walked slowly to their living room, her heels clicking against marble floors that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. The space was a monument to Richard's success: Italian leather furniture, original artwork, windows that showcased their view of Central Park. She'd chosen every piece herself, spending months coordinating with designers and architects to create a home that would reflect their shared dreams. Now it felt like a museum to a life that had apparently ended without her realizing it. "I'll need some time to pack," she said quietly. "The morning will be sufficient. I've arranged for a car to take you to the plaza. I'll cover the hotel costs for 1 week while you find an apartment." 1 week, 22 years of marriage, and he was giving her 1 week of hotel costs as a severance package. Margaret turned to face him, studying the man she'd married when she was 23 and he was 30. She'd met him at a coffee shop near Columbia Business School, where she was finishing her MBA and he was presenting his business plan to anyone who would listen. His company, Blackstone Industries, existed only on paper than a dream of revolutionizing corporate consulting with technology-driven solutions. She'd believed in his vision. More than that, she'd helped him build it. "Do you remember when you first told me about Blackstone Industries?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. Richard's jaw tightened. "Margaret, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. You were so nervous that day in the coffee shop. You'd been turned down by 12 investors, and you were starting to think your idea wasn't viable. Do you remember what I told you? I remember you were young and naive enough to think love could build a business empire. I told you that your vision was brilliant, but you needed better financial backing and a partner who understood both the technical and interpersonal sides of corporate consulting. Margaret sat down on their sofa, the same Italian leather they'd bought to celebrate her first major consulting contract 15 years ago. I told you I wanted to be that partner. And you were? For a while. Richard walked down the stairs, his movements precise and controlled. But business evolution requires adaptation. Margaret, I've adapted. You've remained static. Static. As if 22 years of marriage, of supporting his dreams while building her own consulting firm, of standing beside him at every corporate event and charity gala, was somehow standing still. Margaret thought about the contract she'd signed just that morning, a $50 million deal with a tech consortium that would make her consulting firm one of the most successful in the city. She'd called Richard immediately, eager to share the news, to celebrate together the way they used to when they were younger, and every success felt like a shared victory. He'd been too busy to talk. He was always too busy these days. I suppose Jennifer is more adaptable, Margaret said. Jennifer understands what it means to be ambitious. She doesn't see success as something that happens to her. She sees it as something she creates. The irony was breathtaking. Margaret had built her consulting business from nothing, working 18-hour days while Richard traveled and expanded Blackstone Industries. She'd turned down dozens of offers to join larger firms because she believed in creating something of her own, something that would complement Richard's empire without competing with it. Apparently, that counted as having success happen to her rather than creating it. Margaret stood and walked to the window, watching rain streak down the glass. Below them, the city continued its relentless rhythm, millions of people living their lives while hers imploded in real time. I'll pack tonight, she said finally. She heard Richard's footsteps moving toward his study. My attorney will be in touch tomorrow about dividing assets. We'll keep things civilized. Civilized. As if there was something civilized about throwing away more than 2 decades of shared life for a woman young enough to be his daughter. Margaret waited until she heard his study door close before reaching for her purse. The pregnancy test felt impossibly light in her hands. 2 pink lines that represented everything she'd thought they wanted and everything she now realized she'd have to face alone. At 45, she was about to become a single mother with no home and a husband who saw her as nothing more than dead weight he'd finally decided to jettison. But as she stood in the penthouse they'd built together, surrounded by the evidence of their shared success, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a spark of the same determination that had driven her to build her consulting business. To believe in Richard's dreams when no one else would. To create a life that mattered. If Richard wanted to see what she was capable of creating on her own, perhaps it was time to show him. The storm outside was weakening, but the one inside Margaret Chen was just beginning. 3 hours earlier, the coffee shop on Fifth Avenue had buzzed with morning energy, and Margaret Chen had felt like she was finally living the life she'd always imagined for herself. The contract signing had gone flawlessly. $50 million over 3 years to revolutionize the technology consulting approach for one of the largest consortiums on the East Coast. Margaret had walked out of that boardroom feeling invincible, her leather portfolio tucked under her arm like armor, against a world that had spent decades telling women over 40 that their best opportunities were behind them. She'd chosen the same coffee shop where she'd first met Richard 23 years ago, a deliberate bit of nostalgia that had seemed romantic at the time. Now, packing her belongings in their penthouse while rain hammered against the windows, the choice felt prophetic in the worst possible way. Honey, I have incredible news, she'd said into her phone, watching steam rise from her vanilla latte while business people in expensive suits hurried past the windows. The consortium contract came through. $50 million. Richard, we did it. The we had been automatic. For 22 years, Margaret's successes had been their successes, just as Richard's victories had belonged to both of them. Or so she'd thought. Can't talk now, Margaret. Big merger meeting with the board. Tell me tonight. Even then, even with excitement bubbling in her chest like champagne, she'd noticed the distance in his voice, The way he'd said her name like it was an inconvenience rather than an endearment. The complete absence of curiosity about what news could have made her call him in the middle of a workday. She should have recognized the signs. The way he'd been working later and later, claiming board meetings that stretched past midnight. The way he'd started showering immediately when he came home instead of sitting with her over dinner to talk about their days. The way he'd stopped asking about her business, as if her consulting firm was a hobby rather than the company she'd spent 15 years building into a powerhouse. Margaret pulled her suitcases from their walk-in closet, the sound of wheels against hardwood echoing through their bedroom like a countdown timer. 22 years of marriage, and she was leaving with the same 3 pieces of luggage she'd brought when they'd moved in together. Their bedroom still smelled like the lavender candles she'd lit every evening, a ritual that had once been romantic and had gradually become routine. The king-sized bed dominated the space, its Egyptian cotton sheets perfectly arranged by their housekeeper. How many conversations had they had in this room? How many dreams had they shared lying side by side, planning their future like architects designing a cathedral? Margaret opened her dresser drawer and began folding clothes with mechanical precision. 22 years of her life, and she was reducing it to 3 suitcases and whatever dignity she could salvage from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed against the dresser's surface. A text message from an unknown number, clearly meant for Richard but sent to her by mistake. Can't wait for tonight, baby. Finally getting rid of the old wife. See you in our bed soon. Miri. Margaret stared at the screen until the letters seemed to blur together. Our bed. Jennifer had been planning this moment, anticipating it, counting down the days until she could move into the home Margaret had decorated, the life Margaret had built. How long had they been planning this? How many months had Richard been looking at her across their dinner table, making conversation about her day while mentally calculating the most efficient way to dispose of her? How many times had he kissed her goodnight while already preparing for the morning when he'd no longer have to pretend Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled through the message history on Richard's phone, which he'd left charging on his nightstand with the careless confidence of a man who'd never expected to be caught. Months of messages, restaurant reservations at places he'd claimed were business dinners, hotel bookings in cities where Margaret thought he was attending conferences alone. My lawyer says the divorce will be clean if we move fast, read one message from 2 weeks ago. She doesn't understand the business side anyway. Won't fight for assets she doesn't know exist. Assets she doesn't know exist. Margaret set the phone down carefully, her mind racing through 22 years of marriage, trying to catalog everything she might have missed. Richard had always handled their finances, claiming that her time was better spent growing her consulting business while he managed their investments and portfolio. She'd trusted him completely, the way wives of her generation had been raised to trust their husbands with money matters. What assets? What had he been hiding from her? Margaret walked to their home office, a space they'd shared for years but which had gradually become Richard's domain as his business expanded. His mahogany desk dominated the room, surrounded by awards and photos from corporate events. On the wall hung a framed copy of the first contract Blackstone Industries had signed, a $10,000 deal that had felt like winning the lottery. She pulled open the desk drawers systematically, looking for anything that might explain Richard's confidence about their divorce being clean, file folders labeled with abbreviations she didn't recognize, investment statements for accounts she'd never heard of, legal documents with corporate names that meant nothing to her. At the bottom of the largest drawer, she found a manila envelope marked Original Incorporation Documents, Blackstone Industries. Margaret pulled out the papers, yellowed with age, and spread them across the desk surface. The documents were dated 23 years ago, just after she and Richard had gotten married. Page after page of legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. But at the bottom of the third page, she found something that made her heart stop her own signature. Next to a paragraph about initial investment and ownership percentages. Margaret Chen, 51%, Richard Blackstone, 49%. She read the numbers 3 times before their meaning penetrated. According to these documents, she owned 51% of Blackstone Industries. Not Richard, her, but that was impossible. Richard's company was worth over $4 billion. He was the CEO, the founder, the face of the empire. She was just his wife, the woman he was now discarding for someone younger and more adaptable. Unless, unless she wasn't just his wife. Unless she'd been his business partner all along, and both of them had simply forgotten. Margaret sat down heavily in Richard's leather chair. The original incorporation documents scattered across the desk like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. 23 years ago, when Richard's dreams had been bigger than his bank account, she'd invested her grandmother's inheritance in his startup. $500,000, everything her grandmother had saved over a lifetime of careful living. At the time, it had seemed like a wedding gift to their shared future. Margaret had just finished her MBA. Richard was brilliant but undercapitalized, and they'd both believed they were building something together. The legal paperwork had been a formality, a way to structure the investment to minimize taxes and protect them both if the business failed. They'd never imagined it would succeed beyond their wildest dreams, and they'd apparently never imagined that success would destroy them. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found David Martinez's number. David had been their lawyer for years, handling everything from their wills to their real estate purchases. If anyone could explain what these documents meant, it was him. "David, it's Margaret Chen. I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. It's about Richard and me, and it's urgent." David's warm voice carried a note of concern. "Margaret, are you all right? You sound upset." "Richard is divorcing me," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But I think I may have found something he doesn't know I know about." After she hung up, Margaret sat alone in Richard's study, surrounded by the evidence of the empire they'd built together. Through the windows, she could see the lights of Manhattan twinkling like stars. Millions of people living their lives, while hers transformed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her phone buzzed with another text from Jennifer, this one clearly intended for Richard. "Did you tell her yet? I'm so excited to start our new life together. Can't wait to be the wife of a billionaire." Margaret turned off the phone and returned to packing. Jennifer could have the bed and the penthouse, and the man who'd thrown away 22 years of marriage for someone young enough to be his daughter. But she might not be getting the billionaire she thought she was marrying. Margaret touched her still flat stomach, thinking about the pregnancy test hidden in her purse and the baby who would be born into a very different world than the one she'd imagined just hours ago. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be facing it as the discarded wife of a successful man. She'd be facing it as Margaret Chen, majority shareholder of a $4 billion empire. The Plaza Hotel's marble lobby felt like a monument to temporary living, filled with travelers who were either beginning adventures or running from disasters. At 7:30 the next morning, Margaret sat in an overstuffed chair near the concierge desk, her laptop balanced on her knees as she tried to maintain some semblance of normal business operations, while her personal life imploded in real time. Her phone buzzed with another message, and Margaret's heart sank, expecting another accidental text from Jennifer about their plans for her former life. Instead, she found something far more illuminating. The message was clearly meant for Richard, but Jennifer's excitement had apparently made her careless with contact selection. "Baby, I can't believe how stupid she was all these years. 22 years of marriage, and she never even looked at the business paperwork. My lawyer says once the divorce is final, we can restructure Blackstone Industries however we want. She'll never know what hit her. See you tonight in our penthouse." Margaret read the message twice before its full implications settled in. Jennifer wasn't just Richard's mistress. She was his co-conspirator in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated financial betrayal. And they both assumed Margaret was too naive or too trusting to understand the business implications of their divorce. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Margaret scrolled up through the message history, her anger growing with each exchange. For months, Richard and Jennifer had been planning not just his personal escape from their marriage, but a complete financial restructuring that would leave Margaret with minimal assets while they built a new empire together. "The merger with Davidson Corp will be perfect timing," read one message from 3 weeks ago. "Once Margaret is out of the picture, we can move forward with the acquisition. She would never understand the potential anyway." Davidson Corp. Margaret knew that name. It was Jennifer's family business, a mid-sized consulting firm that had been struggling for years. According to these messages, Richard had been planning to use Blackstone Industries' resources to buy out Davidson Corp at an inflated price, essentially transferring millions of dollars to Jennifer's family while disguising it as a legitimate business transaction. My cousin says the divorce settlement will be standard, maybe 10 million if she's lucky. Read another message. Then we'll have everything we need to build our real empire. Just you and me, baby, without any dead weight holding us back. Dead weight, 22 years of marriage. And that's how they saw her contribution to the life they'd built together. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her descent into fury. David Martinez's name appeared on the screen, and she answered with relief. Margaret, I've been reviewing documents all night. David's warm voice carried a note of excitement that cut through her anger. Can you meet me at my office in an hour? I think you're going to want to see what I found. David, before we meet, there's something else you need to know. Margaret read him the key messages from Jennifer, watching early morning joggers pass by the hotel's windows as she detailed the conspiracy she'd uncovered. Those idiots, David said when she finished. Margaret, they've just handed us everything we need to prove fraudulent intent, but that's not even the best part of what I discovered last night. An hour later, Margaret sat in David Martinez's law office, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a man who'd spent 30 years fighting for clients who'd been underestimated by their opponents. David's diplomas and awards covered one wall, but Margaret's attention was focused on the stack of documents spread across his conference table. Margaret, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened 23 years ago when Richard started Blackstone Industries, David said, settling into his chair with the careful attention of a detective gathering evidence. Richard had the business plan and the vision, but no capital, Margaret said, her memory clearing as she talked. I just inherited $500,000 from my grandmother, her entire life savings. Richard needed $400,000 to get started, and I believed in his dream. And the legal structure. Do you remember signing incorporation papers? Margaret nodded slowly. Richard said we needed to formalize the investment for tax purposes. His lawyer, I can't remember his name, had us sign a bunch of paperwork. Richard said it was just to protect us both legally, that it didn't really matter since we were married and everything was shared anyway. David smiled, and Margaret realized she'd never seen him look quite so satisfied. Margaret, Richard's lawyer was an idiot, and Richard compounded that error by never consulting a competent attorney about restructuring ownership as the company grew. He handed her a fresh copy of the original incorporation documents. According to these papers, which are legally binding and filed with the state, you own 51% of Blackstone Industries. Richard owns 49%. Every expansion, every acquisition, every billion-dollar deal over the past 23 years, you own the majority stake in all of it. Margaret stared at the documents, the numbers refusing to make sense. But that's impossible. Richard runs everything. He makes all the decisions. I've never even attended a board meeting. That's because Richard has been operating illegally for 23 years, David explained. Every major corporate decision requires majority shareholder approval. Every expansion, every acquisition, every executive hire, Richard has been making decisions he had no legal authority to make. The implications crashed over Margaret like a tidal wave. Are you saying? I'm saying Richard doesn't own Blackstone Industries. You do. The company is worth approximately $4 billion, and you own 51% of it. Your share is worth roughly $2 billion. Margaret felt like the hotel room was spinning around her. $2 billion. And that's conservative. But Margaret, there's more. David's expression grew serious. Based on the messages you showed me from Jennifer, Richard has been planning to use company resources for fraudulent purposes. The Davidson Corp acquisition, the financial restructuring, the attempts to hide assets from you, all of that constitutes criminal misuse of corporate funds. What does that mean for him? It means your millionaire ex-husband is about to discover that his plan to discard you financially was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually controls the money. Margaret stood and walked to David's window, which overlooked the same city where Richard was probably sitting in his office at that very moment, planning his future with Jennifer and assuming Margaret would quietly accept whatever settlement he offered her. David, what would happen if I showed up at the board meeting this morning and announced that I'm the majority shareholder? David's smile was almost predatory. Richard's been calling an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. to approve the Davidson Corp acquisition. If you show up and exercise your majority voting rights, you can block the acquisition and demand a full audit of all corporate decisions made without your approval. Which means which means every decision Richard has made in the past 5 years could be legally challenged. The company could face massive liability issues. The board could remove him as CEO for operating without proper authorization. Margaret thought about Jennifer's message about restructuring Blackstone Industries however they wanted once the divorce was final. They'd assumed she was too naive to understand business, too trusting to question their decisions, too passive to fight for what was rightfully hers. They were about to learn the difference between naive and unsuspecting. David, I want you to come with me to that board meeting. Margaret, are you sure once we do this, there's no going back? You'll be taking control of a $4 billion company and destroying Richard's reputation in the process. Margaret thought about the 22 years she'd spent supporting Richard's dreams while building her own success. She thought about the pregnancy test in her purse and the child who deserved a mother who fought for her future instead of accepting whatever scraps she was offered. She thought about all the women who'd been discarded by men who assumed they were too weak or too ignorant to fight back. Richard wants to see what I'm capable of creating on my own, she said quietly. Let's show him. As they prepared to leave for Blackstone Industries, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the electric anticipation of a woman who was about to remind the world exactly what she was capable of achieving. Her millionaire ex-husband was about to become her very expensive employee. The glass towers of Manhattan's financial district gleamed in the morning sunlight as Margaret and David walked the 3 blocks from his office to Blackstone Industries. Margaret had chosen her navy Armani suit carefully, the one Richard had always criticized for making her look too corporate, and carried a leather briefcase that contained 23 years' worth of legal ammunition. Are you nervous? David asked as they approached the building where Margaret had attended dozens of company holiday parties, but never a single board meeting. Terrified, Margaret admitted. But not of them. I'm terrified of what I might discover about myself if I don't do this. The lobby of Blackstone Industries was a monument to success, with soaring ceilings and walls lined with awards and photographs documenting the company's growth from Richard's startup dream to a $4 billion empire. Margaret had always felt proud walking through this space, knowing she'd helped build everything she saw. Now she realized she'd helped build it in more ways than she'd ever understood. I'm here for the 9 a.m. board meeting, Margaret announced to the receptionist, a young woman who looked barely old enough to have graduated college. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name on the board meeting list. Are you sure you have the right? Tell Richard Blackstone that the majority shareholder has arrived. The receptionist's fingers froze over her keyboard. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Margaret could see Richard presenting financial projections to 6 board members, while Jennifer sat at the far end of the table, taking notes with the concentrated attention of someone planning to inherit everything in the room. Margaret waited, watching Richard's animated gestures as he sold the board on whatever scheme he and Jennifer had concocted. He looked confident and authoritative, every inch the successful CEO who'd built an empire through vision and determination. In 5 minutes, he was going to discover that his empire had never legally belonged to him. The receptionist hung up her phone with a confused expression. Mr. Blackstone says he'll be right out. Richard emerged from the conference room with the controlled stride of a man accustomed to handling minor disruptions efficiently. His expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to something approaching panic as he registered Margaret's presence in David's briefcase. Margaret, what are you doing here? We agreed you'd stay at the hotel until... We agreed on nothing, Margaret interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I'm here for the board meeting. As the majority shareholder, I believe I'm entitled to participate in any decisions affecting the company's future. Richard's face went pale. Majority shareholder Margaret, you don't understand business terminology. You can't just... Actually, she can, David said smoothly, extending his hand to Richard. David Martinez, Margaret's attorney. I believe we need to discuss some foundational issues about corporate ownership and decision-making authority. Through the glass walls, Margaret could see the board members shifting in their seats, clearly picking up on the tension even though they couldn't hear the conversation. Jennifer had stopped taking notes and was staring at them with an expression that suggested their carefully laid plans were about to encounter an unexpected obstacle. This is ridiculous, Richard said, but his voice carried less conviction than usual. Margaret, you're embarrassing yourself. You don't know anything about running a company. You're right, Margaret said calmly. I don't know anything about running a company, but I know a great deal about owning one. She brushed past Richard and walked into the conference room, David following close behind. The 6 board members, all men over 50, who'd known her for years as Richard's supportive wife, looked up with varying degrees of confusion and concern. Gentlemen, Margaret said, taking the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat Richard had clearly been planning to occupy. I'm Margaret Chen, and I own 51% of Blackstone Industries. This meeting is now under new management. Shahanur, the silence in the room was deafening. Jennifer's pen had stopped moving entirely, and her breathy voice cracked when she finally spoke. Richard, what is she talking about? Richard entered the room behind them, his usual composure completely shattered. Margaret, please don't do this. We can discuss whatever concerns you have privately. David, please read the incorporation documents aloud for the board, Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority she'd never known she possessed. David's warm voice filled the room as he read the legal text establishing Margaret's majority ownership stake. Each word seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow, and Margaret watched 23 years of assumptions crumble in real time. Board member Roberts cleared his throat nervously. Richard, if these documents are authentic, then every major decision made without majority shareholder approval has been legally questionable at best, including today's proposed acquisition of Davidson Corp., Margaret added quietly, watching Jennifer's face go white. An acquisition that appears to involve purchasing a struggling company at an inflated price for reasons that have more to do with personal relationships than sound business strategy. How did you, Jennifer started, then stopped herself. How did I know about your family's company? Margaret smiled. The same way I know about the hotel bookings, the restaurant reservations, and the very detailed text messages discussing how you plan to restructure this company after disposing of the dead weight that's been holding Richard back. Richard's voice rose to a shout. This is insane, Margaret. You can't just waltz in here and destroy everything I've built. Everything we built, Margaret corrected. And I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to prevent you from committing fraud with company resources. The room erupted in chaos. Board members were passing the incorporation documents around the table, their voices rising as they realized the legal implications. Jennifer was frantically typing on her phone, probably alerting her family that their financial rescue plan had just collapsed. Richard was pacing behind his chair like a caged animal, his usual strategic composure completely abandoned. Richard, Margaret said quietly, and somehow her voice cut through the noise. 22 years ago, you told me that marriage was a partnership. You were right, but so was business. I invested my grandmother's life savings in your dream because I believed in what we could accomplish together. And look what we accomplished. Richard gestured wildly around the room. $4 billion in empire. Everything we ever dreamed of. Everything I ever dreamed of was a partnership, Margaret replied. What you built was a dictatorship where I was expected to provide resources and support while you made all the decisions. That ends today. Board member Williams, who'd known Margaret since the early days of the company, leaned forward in his chair. Margaret, what exactly are you proposing? Margaret looked around the table at these men who'd seen her only as Richard's wife for more than 2 decades. Today, they were going to have to see her as something entirely different. I'm proposing that this company start following its own legal structure, she said. I'm proposing that major decisions be made with proper majority shareholder approval, and I'm proposing that we conduct a complete audit of all corporate decisions made in the past 5 years to ensure that company resources haven't been misused for personal gain. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jennifer quietly sobbing. Richard's voice, and when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Margaret, please, we can work this out privately. Don't destroy everything in front of... I'm not destroying anything, Margaret said, standing up from her chair. I'm saving it. From fraud, from mismanagement, and from people who think that narcissistic abuse is an acceptable business strategy. She looked around the table one more time, meeting each board member's eyes. Gentlemen, I'll be back tomorrow morning with a full legal team to discuss the transition process. Today's acquisition of Davidson Corp is postponed indefinitely, pending a complete review of the proposal's financial justification. As Margaret walked toward the door, she heard Jennifer's voice rising to a shriek. Richard, you promised me this company. You said she was just some housewife who didn't understand business. Margaret paused at the threshold and turned back to face the room. I was never just a housewife, she said clearly. I was your business partner. You just forgot. The door closed behind them with a satisfying click, leaving Richard to explain to his board and his mistress how a woman they'd all underestimated had just taken control of everything they thought belonged to them. Margaret's phone buzzed as they waited for the elevator. A text from her assistant. The consortium called. They want to move forward with expanding our contract to $75 million over 5 years. Congratulations. Margaret smiled as the elevator doors opened. Her consulting business was thriving. She was about to become the CEO of a $4 billion company, and somewhere in Richard's conference room, Jennifer was learning the difference between marrying a millionaire and marrying a man who just discovered he was actually an employee. This was turning out to be a very interesting week for her midlife transformation. The elevator ride down from the 42nd floor felt like descending from one life into another. Margaret watched the numbers tick by, each floor representing another layer of assumptions being stripped away. By the time they reached the lobby, she felt like an entirely different woman than the one who'd walked in 30 minutes earlier. That was extraordinary, David said as they stepped onto the marble floor. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anyone take control of a hostile situation quite so effectively. Margaret's hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over, adrenaline making her fingers tremble as she adjusted her briefcase strap. David, what happens next legally? I mean, can Richard fight this? He can try, but the documentation is ironclad. The incorporation papers are legally filed with the state, they're properly notarized, and they clearly establish your majority ownership. David's voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who just won an unwinnable case. Richard's only option would be to claim that the original documents were fraudulent, which would require him to admit that he's been operating a multi-billion-dollar company based on fraudulent paperwork for 23 years. They walked through the lobby, past the photographs of Richard receiving various business awards and shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. Margaret had attended most of those events, standing beside him in designer gowns and smiling for cameras while he accepted recognition for building an empire that had apparently belonged to her all along. The board members looked terrified, Margaret observed. They should be. Every decision they've approved without majority shareholder consent could expose them to personal liability. They're going to want to distance themselves from Richard very quickly and align themselves with you. Margaret's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, expecting another accidental message from Jennifer. Margaret Chen, this is Roberts from the board meeting. I need to speak with you urgently about the transition process. Margaret stopped walking, surprised by how quickly the political winds had shifted. Mr. Roberts, the meeting just ended 10 minutes ago. I know, and I need you to understand that several of us had no knowledge of Richard's irregular decision-making process. We've been operating under the assumption that he had full authority as CEO and founder. And now we need to discuss how to protect the company's interests during what I assume will be a significant leadership transition. Margaret, can you meet with the board tomorrow morning without Richard present? Margaret looked at David, who was nodding enthusiastically. Yes, Mr. Roberts, I'll be there at 9 a.m. with my legal team. After she hung up, David was grinning like a man who'd just discovered buried treasure. Margaret, they're abandoning ship. Richard's about to find himself completely isolated. They walked toward David's office, passing coffee shops and restaurants where Margaret had shared countless meals with Richard over the years. How many of those conversations had been lies? How many times had he looked at her across a dinner table, knowing he was planning to discard her while she believed they were building a future together? David, there's something else I need to tell you, Margaret said as they turned the corner onto David Street. I'm pregnant. David stopped walking entirely. Pregnant Margaret. That changes everything. Are you planning to? I don't know yet. I'm 45. David, I've spent my entire adult life building a career and supporting Richard's dreams. I never thought I'd have children. And now, Margaret touched her still flat stomach. Now I'm about to be a single mother running a $4 billion company. Or you could hire the best management team in the world and focus on being a mother. With $2 billion, I could hire the best everything in the world. They walked the rest of the way to David's office in thoughtful silence. Margaret's mind was racing through possibilities she'd never imagined: corporate boardrooms and nurseries, pregnancy leave policies for CEOs, the surreal logistics of raising a child while managing one of the largest consulting firms in the country. Back at David's office, they spent 2 hours developing a strategy for the board meeting. Margaret would need to present a transition plan that protected the company's interests while demonstrating her competence to lead. They'd also need to address the legal implications of Richard's unauthorized decision-making and the potential criminal charges related to the Davidson Corp acquisition scheme. "Margaret, I have to ask," David said as they reviewed corporate governance documents. "What do you want to do with Richard? You could have him arrested for fraud. You could sue him for misappropriation of corporate funds. You could destroy his reputation completely." Margaret considered the question. Part of her wanted revenge for 22 years of being underestimated, for the casual cruelty of his dismissal, for the way he'd planned to manipulate their divorce to cheat her out of assets that had always been rightfully hers. But a larger part of her just wanted to move forward. "I want him gone from the company," she said finally. "Permanently. But I don't want to spend the next 5 years of my life in court battles. I want to build something better than what he was destroying." "That's generous of you. It's practical. Revenge is expensive, and I have better things to do with my time and money." Margaret's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Richard's number. "Margaret, please." Richard's voice was strained, desperate in a way she'd never heard before. "Can we meet privately? There has to be a way to work this out without destroying everything." "Richard, you destroyed our marriage for your secretary. I'm trying to save the company from fraud charges. I made mistakes. I know that. But Margaret, this company is my life's work." "No, Richard, this company is our life's work. The difference is that I remember we were supposed to be partners. What do you want? Money? I can give you a settlement that will set you up for life." Margaret laughed, surprising herself with the genuine amusement in her voice. "Richard, I don't need you to set me up for life. I already own the company that was supposed to do that." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Margaret thought he'd hung up. "This isn't over," Richard said finally, his voice carrying a hint of the cold calculation she'd heard the night he'd thrown her out. "You're right," Margaret agreed. "It's just beginning." After she hung up, David was watching her with something that looked like admiration. "You know," he said, "I think Richard may have just made the most expensive mistake in corporate history." Margaret gathered her papers and stood to leave. She had a hotel room to return to, a pregnancy to process, and a $4 billion company to learn how to run. Tomorrow, she'd walk into that boardroom not as Richard's discarded wife, but as the majority owner of an empire that had always belonged to her. But first, she was going to order room service, take a long bath, and call her sister to explain how her life had completely transformed in the space of 24 hours. It was turning out to be a very good week for women supporting women, especially when one of those women happened to own 51% of everything her millionaire ex-husband thought he'd built without her. Margaret woke up in her Plaza Hotel suite at 5:30 a.m., her body responding to decades of early morning routine, even though her life had been completely upended in the span of 48 hours. She ordered coffee from room service and sat by the window overlooking Central Park, watching joggers and dog walkers begin their day, while she prepared for the most important business meeting of her life. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter like a small pink reminder that everything was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine yet. At 45, she was about to become a single mother and the CEO of a $4 billion company. The irony wasn't lost on her that Richard's attempt to discard her had actually freed her to discover who she really was when no one else was defining her identity. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda in California. "Mom called. She's worried because you haven't returned her messages. Should I tell her you're busy taking over a multinational corporation?" Margaret smiled and typed back, "Tell her I'm having a midlife transformation that's going better than expected." By 8 a.m., Margaret was dressed in her most authoritative suit, charcoal gray with a silk blouse that Richard had once called intimidating, and reviewing notes with David in the Blackstone Industries lobby. The same receptionist from yesterday looked nervous as she announced Margaret's arrival, clearly aware that the corporate power structure had shifted dramatically overnight. The board members started arriving at 7:30, David observed. "They're taking this very seriously." "Good." They should be. Margaret walked through the corridors she'd navigated as a visitor for 23 years, now seeing everything from the perspective of someone who'd always owned what she was looking at. The abstract artwork, the imported marble floors, the view of Manhattan from the 42nd floor, all of it had been purchased with profits from a company that belonged to her. The conference room was arranged differently than it had been the day before. Instead of Richard's usual position at the head of the table, there was an empty chair that clearly awaited Margaret's arrival. The 6 board members stood as she entered, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, taking her seat with the calm authority of someone who was finally occupying her rightful place. "Thank you for making time for this meeting. I believe we have several urgent matters to discuss." Roberts, who had clearly been elected as the group's spokesperson, cleared his throat nervously. "Margaret, first, I want to apologize on behalf of the board for any irregularities in how corporate decisions have been made. We had no knowledge that proper shareholder approval wasn't being obtained." "I appreciate that, Mr. Roberts, but let's focus on moving forward rather than assigning blame for past mistakes." David opened his briefcase and distributed copies of a transition plan they'd prepared the night before. "What we're proposing is a structured leadership change that protects the company's interests while ensuring full legal compliance going forward." Margaret watched the board members review the documents, their faces reflecting various degrees of relief and apprehension. These were men who'd built their careers on managing risk, and Richard's unauthorized decision-making had exposed them all to potential lawsuits and criminal liability. "The first priority is a complete audit of all major corporate decisions made in the past 5 years," Margaret explained. "We need to identify any transactions that might have been made without proper authorization, especially those involving potential conflicts of interest." Board member Williams looked up from his copy of the transition plan. "Are you referring specifically to the Davidson Corp acquisition proposal?" "Among other things, yes. I've discovered evidence suggesting that some proposed business decisions may have been motivated by personal rather than corporate interests." Margaret had decided not to reveal the full extent of Richard and Jennifer's conspiracy unless it became legally necessary. The board members were smart enough to read between the lines, and preserving some level of discretion would make the transition smoother for everyone involved. "What about Richard?" asked board member Thompson. "What's his role going forward?" Margaret had anticipated this question. Richard will be offered a generous severance package and the opportunity to maintain his 49% ownership stake as a silent partner. However, his role as CEO ends immediately. The relief in the room was palpable. None of these men wanted to be involved in a messy corporate battle that could damage their own reputations and expose them to legal liability. "Margaret," Roberts said carefully, "do you plan to serve as CEO yourself, or would you prefer to hire professional management?" It was the question Margaret had been asking herself since yesterday. She had 20 years of consulting experience and an MBA from Columbia. But running a $4 billion corporation was different from managing her own small firm. "Initially, I'll serve as interim CEO while we conduct a search for permanent leadership," she said. "But I want to be clear, any CEO we hire will report to me as majority shareholder and board chair." David handed out additional documents outlining the corporate governance changes that would need to be implemented. "We're proposing a complete restructuring of decision-making authority to ensure that all major corporate actions receive proper shareholder approval going forward." "What about the employees?" Williams asked. "How do we maintain stability during the transition?" "We announced the leadership change as a planned succession that's been in development for some time," Margaret replied. "Richard and I have been married for 22 years. From the employee's perspective, this is a family business transitioning from husband to wife leadership. It was a narrative that would preserve everyone's dignity while protecting the company's reputation. Richard could maintain his image as a successful entrepreneur who was stepping back for personal reasons, and Margaret could assume leadership without having to explain the marital drama that had precipitated the change." The meeting continued for 2 hours, covering everything from media strategy to financial reporting procedures. By the time they finished, Margaret had a clear understanding of what she'd inherited: a profitable, well-managed company that had been operating efficiently despite Richard's legal oversights. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as the meeting was wrapping up. "I want to establish a $50 million fund for women entrepreneurs over 40. It will be a separate division focused on supporting women who are starting or expanding businesses in their midlife. The board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the proposal. It's a market that's been traditionally underserved, Margaret explained. Women over 40 have experience, capital, and motivation, but they often face discrimination from traditional funding sources. I believe it's both a social opportunity and a profitable business strategy. Roberts nodded slowly. That's actually a brilliant market positioning strategy. It differentiates us from every other corporate consulting firm. Exactly, we're not just changing leadership, we're expanding our mission. As the board members gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Margaret felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She'd spent 22 years supporting Richard's vision for this company. Now she was finally free to implement her own. Margaret, David said after the room had cleared, how do you feel? Margaret walked to the conference room windows, looking out over the Manhattan skyline, where millions of people were working in offices and restaurants and shops, building their own versions of success. I feel like I'm finally awake, she said. Her phone buzzed with a message from her business partner at the consulting firm. The consortium wants to expand our contract again. They're talking about $100 million over 7 years. You're on fire. Margaret smiled, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach where her future child was growing. In the space of 3 days, she'd gone from being a discarded wife to being the owner of a $4 billion empire and the mother-to-be of a child who would inherit a very different world than the one Margaret had grown up in. It was turning out to be an excellent week for discovering what she was really capable of creating when no one was telling her to stay small. Richard's office had always been a shrine to his success, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Walls lined with awards and photographs of him shaking hands with celebrities and politicians. A mahogany desk that had cost more than most people's cars. Margaret had visited this space hundreds of times over the years, usually to attend company parties or bring Richard forgotten documents. She'd never entered it as his boss before. Richard, Margaret said as she knocked on his open door. We need to talk. He looked up from his computer screen, and Margaret was struck by how much he'd aged in the past 3 days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Margaret, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I heard about the board meeting. Congratulations on your new position. The sarcasm in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret closed the door behind her and took a seat in one of the leather chairs across from his desk, the same chairs where she'd sat as a supportive wife while he made phone calls and reviewed contracts. Richard, I want to discuss your severance package and transition timeline. My severance package, Richard's voice rose slightly. Margaret, this is my company. I built it from nothing. You can't just, I can, and I am. Margaret's voice remained steady. The board has accepted my proposal for a leadership transition. You'll receive 18 months of salary as severance, plus full benefits and the right to maintain your 49% ownership stake as a silent partner. Silent partner. Richard stood up from his desk, pacing to the windows that had showcased his empire for 2 decades. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You don't understand the first thing about running a company this size? Then it's fortunate that I have an excellent board of directors and the resources to hire the best management team in the industry. Margaret watched him struggle with the reality that his opinion was no longer relevant to decisions about the company's future. For 23 years, Richard had been the final authority on every aspect of Blackstone Industries. Now he was discovering what it felt like to be powerless in a situation he'd helped create. The Davidson Corp acquisition he started has been canceled permanently, Margaret interrupted. The board and I agreed that it represented an unacceptable conflict of interest. Richard turned from the window to face her, his expression shifting from frustration to something approaching desperation. Margaret, you're destroying opportunities that took me years to develop. Jennifer's family business has real potential. Jennifer's family business is a failing enterprise that you were planning to prop up with corporate funds as a wedding gift to your new wife, Margaret said calmly. That's called fraud, Richard. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of traffic from the street below. Richard walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, the weight of his situation finally settling on his shoulders. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "I want you to sign the severance agreement and transition your responsibilities to the interim management team over the next 2 weeks. After that, you're free to pursue whatever opportunities interest you. With what money, my ownership stake doesn't give me access to liquid capital." Margaret pulled a document from her briefcase and slid it across his desk. "I'm prepared to buy out your 49% stake for fair market value. $2 billion, paid out over 5 years with favorable interest terms." Richard stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. "You're buying me out. I'm offering you financial independence and a clean break from the company. You can start your own firm, travel the world, or spend the rest of your life on a beach somewhere. But you can't continue to operate as if you own something that belongs to someone else." Margaret watched emotions play across Richard's face. Anger, confusion, and something that might have been relief. Running a $4 billion company was an enormous responsibility, and Richard had been carrying that weight alone for 23 years. "What about Jennifer?" he asked. "What about her? We're planning to get married once our divorce is final." Margaret almost laughed at the naivety in his voice. "Richard, Jennifer was planning to marry the owner of a $4 billion company. Are you confident she'll be equally interested in marrying a man with a $2 billion payout spread over 5 years?" The question hit its mark. Richard's shoulders sagged as he realized that Jennifer's enthusiasm for their relationship might have been more financial than romantic. "You think she was using me?" "I think Jennifer is a smart young woman who saw an opportunity to improve her financial situation dramatically. Now that the opportunity has changed, you'll discover whether her feelings for you were genuine." Margaret stood to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her at the door. "Margaret, do you hate me?" The question surprised her with its vulnerability. Margaret turned back to face the man she'd loved for 22 years. The man who'd built an empire with her investment and her support. The man who'd thrown her away when he thought he'd found something better. "No, Richard, I don't hate you, but I don't forgive you either. You didn't just betray our marriage, you tried to steal what was always partly mine and convinced yourself I was too stupid to notice." "I never thought you were stupid. You thought I was naive enough to accept whatever settlement you offered me while you restructured the company to benefit your girlfriend." "That's worse than thinking I was stupid. That's thinking I was worthless." Richard looked down at the severance agreement, his pen poised over the signature line. "What if I refuse to sign? Then David will file criminal charges for corporate fraud, and you'll lose everything anyway. This way, you get to walk away with your dignity and enough money to build whatever life you want." Margaret watched him sign the document with the mechanical movements of someone who'd finally accepted defeat. 23 years of marriage and business partnership, reduced to a legal contract that would sever their connection forever. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "I'm pregnant." Richard's pen stopped moving entirely. "Pregnant, but we haven't. In months. The baby was conceived before you decided to end our marriage. I found out the night you threw me out. Margaret, that changes everything. We could nothing. You made your choice when you decided Jennifer was more important than 22 years of marriage. I'm simply informing you that your actions affected more people than you realized." Richard set down his pen and looked at her with something that might have been regret. "Are you going to keep the baby?" "That's my decision to make." Margaret left his office without looking back, closing the door on 23 years of shared history. In the hallway, she passed Jennifer's desk, now occupied by a temporary secretary since Jennifer had apparently stopped coming to work after the board meeting. Smart girl. She'd recognized a sinking ship and abandoned it before the final rescue boats departed. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. "Board approved your interim CEO appointment unanimously. Congratulations. Boss." As Margaret walked through the corridors of the company she now controlled, employees nodded respectfully and called her Mr. Chen, a title that felt strange and powerful and completely right all at the same time. Her consulting firm was thriving. Her ex-husband was signing severance papers. And somewhere in her body, a baby was growing who would be born into a world where women owned companies instead of just supporting the men who thought they'd built them alone. Margaret Chen was having an excellent week for discovering what happened when a millionaire ex-husband tried to discard a woman who'd always been more powerful than either of them had realized. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood in what had once been Richard's corner office, watching a team of interior designers remove the last traces of his 23-year occupancy. The awards and photographs were being carefully packed and shipped to his new apartment in Queens, a modest two-bedroom that was all he could afford while waiting for his buyout payments to begin. "Mr. Chen," her new assistant Sarah called from the doorway. "The designer is here with fabric samples for the renovation." Mr. Chen. Margaret was still getting used to the title, but she liked how it sounded. Authoritative, permanent, earned. The office transformation was both symbolic and practical. Margaret wanted a space that reflected her leadership style, rather than Richard's less intimidating, more collaborative, with a sitting area for informal meetings and windows that could actually be opened to let in fresh air. "And the quarterly reports?" Margaret asked, reviewing her schedule for the afternoon. "Ready for your review. The numbers look excellent. Profits are up 18% since the leadership transition." Margaret smiled. Wall Street had initially been nervous about the change in leadership, but the company's strong performance and her background in consulting had quickly reassured investors. The stock price had actually risen 12% since she'd taken over. Her phone rang with a call from Linda in California. "So," her sister said without preamble, "how does it feel to be a billionaire CEO? Overwhelming and exactly right at the same time," Margaret replied, settling into her new chair, ergonomically designed for comfort rather than intimidation. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm not qualified for this." "Honey, you have an MBA from Columbia and 20 years of consulting experience. You're more qualified than most CEOs. I know that intellectually, but there's a difference between knowing something and believing it." Margaret touched her stomach, which was just beginning to show the subtle curve of pregnancy. At 12 weeks, she'd finally told the board about the baby, framing it as a personal milestone that wouldn't affect her professional commitments. Their response had been overwhelmingly supportive. Several board members had shared stories about balancing parenthood with corporate leadership. "Have you decided about the baby?" Linda asked gently. "I'm keeping her, or him. I don't know the gender yet, but I've decided I want to be a mother." "What changed your mind?" Margaret looked out her windows at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about how much her life had transformed in just a month. "I realized I was making the decision based on fear rather than desire. Fear that I was too old. Fear that I couldn't balance motherhood with running a company. Fear that I'd be doing it alone. And now I realize that fear isn't a good enough reason to give up something I want. I have the resources to hire the best help available, and I have the flexibility to structure my work around my family instead of the other way around." Sarah knocked on the office door, carrying a stack of documents that needed Margaret's signature. "Mr. Chen, the Women Entrepreneurs Fund applications are ready for your review. We received over 300 submissions in the first week." Margaret felt a surge of pride. The fund had been her first major initiative as CEO, and the response had exceeded everyone's expectations. Women over 40 were applying from across the country, seeking capital to start businesses or expand existing enterprises. "Schedule meetings with the top 20 candidates for next week," Margaret instructed. "I want to review each application personally." After Sarah left, Linda's voice came through the phone speaker. "You sound different, happier." "I feel like myself for the first time in years. Maybe for the first time ever." "What about Richard? Have you talked to him since the buyout?" Margaret hesitated. "He calls occasionally. I think Jennifer left him once she realized he wasn't actually the billionaire she thought she was marrying." "Good for her. Smart girl. Very smart. She recognized a changed situation and adapted accordingly. I can respect that." Margaret's other line beeped with an incoming call from David Martinez. "Linda, I need to take this. My lawyer is calling. Give David my love. And Margaret, I'm proud of you." After switching to David's call, Margaret was surprised by the excitement in his voice. "Margaret, I have news about Richard that you're going to find interesting. Good news or bad news? Depends on your perspective. Richard filed for bankruptcy protection yesterday." Margaret set down her pen, genuinely shocked. "Bankruptcy? How is that possible? He has a $2 billion buyout agreement." Apparently he made some very poor investment decisions with his liquid assets while waiting for the buyout payments to begin. He borrowed heavily against future payments and invested in cryptocurrency and day trading. lost nearly everything. Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions: sympathy for the man she'd once loved, vindication for her decision to maintain financial control, and genuine sadness for how completely Richard had self-destructed. What does that mean for the buyout agreement? The payments will go directly to his creditors instead of to him personally. Richard will end up with very little once his debts are settled. And Jennifer? David's laugh was rueful. Jennifer married the investment banker from Goldman Sachs last week. Apparently, she moved on quickly once she realized Richard's financial situation. Margaret shook her head in amazement. From secretary to billionaire's wife to banker's wife in 6 weeks, that woman has impressive adaptability. Indeed. But Margaret, there's more. Richard's bankruptcy actually creates an opportunity for you. His creditors are willing to sell his 49% stake in Blackstone Industries for significantly less than fair market value. Meaning you could own 100% of the company for about half of what you agreed to pay him originally? Margaret considered the proposal. Complete ownership would give her total control over the company's direction and eliminate any potential complications from Richard's financial problems. Make the offer, she decided, but structure it so Richard gets enough to cover his basic living expenses. I don't want him homeless, just powerless. After hanging up with David, Margaret walked to her windows and looked out over the city where she'd spent her adult life, building a career while supporting someone else's dreams. Below her, millions of people were working in offices and shops and restaurants, most of them unaware that the woman looking down from the 42nd floor had just become the sole owner of a $4 billion empire. Her phone buzzed with a text from her doctor. Test results confirm healthy pregnancy. Baby due in early June. Congratulations. June. Margaret would be giving birth at the beginning of summer, when Central Park would be green and alive with possibility. Her child would be born into a world where anything seemed achievable, where mothers could run corporations and women could own empires, and pregnancy was just another project to be managed alongside everything else life demanded. Sarah knocked on the door again, this time carrying flowers and a card. These just arrived for you, Mr. Chen. The card was from the board of directors. Congratulations on your pregnancy and your exceptional leadership. Blackstone Industries has never been in better hands. Margaret smiled and placed the card on her desk next to a framed photo of her grandmother, the woman whose life savings had made everything possible, whose belief in the importance of women supporting women had shaped Margaret's values long before she understood their significance. Her phone rang with another call, this one from a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who wanted to interview her about being one of the youngest female CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. Youngest? Margaret laughed. I'm 45. Yes, but you're also one of the few women who owns her company outright, rather than just managing it for other shareholders. That's still extremely rare. As Margaret scheduled the interview, she thought about all the women who'd inspired her journey: her grandmother with her fierce independence, her sister with her unwavering support, even Jennifer with her ruthless determination to improve her circumstances. Women supporting women, sometimes in ways they didn't even realize. Margaret's midlife transformation was turning out to be less about starting over and more about finally becoming who she'd always been underneath the expectations and limitations other people had imposed on her. She was 45, pregnant, and the sole owner of a $4 billion company. It was turning out to be an extraordinary year for discovering what was possible when a woman stopped accepting what other people thought she deserved and started claiming what she'd actually earned. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the same coffee shop on Fifth Avenue, where she'd first met Richard 24 years ago, and where she'd celebrated her first major consulting contract the day her marriage imploded. The early spring sunshine streamed through the windows, warming her face as she reviewed quarterly reports that showed Blackstone Industries posting record profits under her leadership. Her pregnancy was unmistakable now, a proud curve beneath her cashmere sweater that had become a symbol of her transformation rather than a complication to be managed. At 36 weeks, she was officially on modified bed rest, which for Margaret meant working from home 3 days a week instead of 5. The Women Entrepreneurs Fund has exceeded all projections, David said, reviewing the documents spread across their corner table. 47 businesses funded, 38 showing significant growth, and 5 already profitable enough to begin repaying their loans ahead of schedule. Margaret smiled, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach, where the baby was doing her morning gymnastics routine. It's working exactly as I hoped. Women over 40 don't just need capital, they need someone who believes in their potential. Speaking of potential, David continued, the Wall Street Journal wants to do a follow-up story about your first year as CEO. They're calling you one of the most successful corporate turnarounds in recent history. Turnaround seems like the wrong word. We didn't turn anything around. We just started operating legally and ethically. David laughed. Margaret, you increased profits by 38%, expanded into 3 new markets, and created a fund that's becoming a model for corporate social responsibility. That's more than just legal compliance. Through the coffee shop window, Margaret could see the building where Blackstone Industries occupied the top 15 floors. Her building now, purchased outright after Richard's creditors had sold his remaining stake for 60 cents on the dollar. The irony wasn't lost on her that Richard's financial incompetence had ultimately given her everything she'd never known she wanted. Have you heard from Richard lately? David asked, following her gaze. Christmas card, Margaret said simply. He's working as a consultant for a small firm in New Jersey. Jennifer's new husband helped him find the position. That's surprisingly generous of her. Jennifer is a pragmatist. Helping Richard find stable employment protects her reputation and eliminates any potential for future complications. She learned from his mistakes. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Doctor says the baby's head is down and ready. Are you nervous? Margaret typed back. Excited. This baby is going to be born into a very different world than the one I grew up in. It was true. Her daughter, she'd learned the gender, at 20 weeks would inherit a company that valued women's contributions, supported entrepreneurship at every age, and operated on the principle that success was something to be shared rather than hoarded. Margaret, David said, there's something else we need to discuss. The adoption papers? Margaret's expression grew serious. 3 months ago, she'd made the difficult decision to arrange for her cousin Rebecca to adopt the baby. Rebecca and her husband had been trying to have children for 8 years, and Margaret had convinced herself that a 45-year-old single mother running a corporation wasn't the ideal situation for raising a child. I've been thinking about that, Margaret said quietly, and I think I made the decision based on what other people expected rather than what I actually wanted. David set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. What do you want? I want to be this baby's mother. I want to raise her to believe she can own companies and change the world, and never accept less than she deserves just because someone else thinks she should be grateful for whatever she's offered. Margaret, you know I support whatever decision you make, but are you sure Rebecca has been preparing for this for months? Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. Rebecca will understand. She knows what it's like to want something so desperately that you're willing to fight for it. That's exactly what I'm doing. The decision felt like the final piece of her transformation falling into place. For too many years, Margaret had made choices based on what seemed practical or expected rather than what she actually desired. This baby was hers, conceived in a marriage that no longer existed, carried through a corporate takeover that had revealed her true identity, soon to be born into a world where her mother owned an empire. We'll need to contact Rebecca today, David said gently. The sooner we address this, the better for everyone involved. Margaret's phone rang with a call from her assistant at Blackstone Industries. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry to interrupt your morning, but there's been a development with the Morrison acquisition. Margaret had been negotiating the purchase of a smaller consulting firm for 3 months, a deal that would expand Blackstone Industries into the West Coast market. What kind of development? They've accepted our offer. All terms, no counterproposal. The contracts are ready for your signature. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. The Morrison acquisition would make Blackstone Industries the largest independent consulting firm in the country, with offices in 12 major cities and a client roster that included Fortune 100 companies. I'll be in this afternoon to review the contracts, Margaret said. After hanging up, she looked at David with a mixture of pride and amazement. A year ago, I was being thrown out of my own home by a man who thought I was too naive to understand business. Today, I just closed a deal that will make my company the industry leader. How does it feel? Like I'm finally living the life I was always supposed to have. Margaret gathered her papers and prepared to leave the coffee shop, the same space where she dreamed of building something meaningful 24 years ago. The dreams had come true, just not in the way she'd originally imagined. As she stood to leave, Margaret spotted a familiar figure across the street. Richard was walking past the Blackstone Industries building, looking smaller and older than she remembered. He glanced up at the corporate logo that no longer belonged to him, his shoulders sagging with the weight of what he'd lost through his own poor decisions. For a moment, their eyes met through the coffee shop window. Margaret felt no anger, no satisfaction at his downfall, just a quiet sense of completion. Richard had given her the greatest gift imaginable by forcing her to discover who she really was when no one else was defining her worth. He raised his hand in a small wave, and Margaret nodded back. Then he continued walking, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians who were hurrying toward their own versions of success and failure. "Any regrets?" David asked, watching the exchange. Margaret considered the question as she adjusted her purse and briefcase, preparing to return to the office where she'd spend the afternoon finalizing deals that would secure her company's dominance in their industry. "Only that it took me 22 years to remember who I really was," she said. As they left the coffee shop, Margaret's phone buzzed with another text from her doctor. "Baby's vital signs perfect. See you next week for final checkup before delivery." Margaret smiled and placed her hand on her stomach, feeling her daughter respond with a strong kick that seemed to say she was ready to meet the world her mother had built for her. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless rhythm, millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their empires, learning the difference between what they thought they deserved and what they were actually capable of achieving. Margaret Chen walked back toward her building, toward the boardroom where she'd make decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue, toward the future she'd created through her own determination rather than her marriage to someone else's ambitions. It had been an extraordinary year for midlife transformation, for discovering that divorce settlement negotiations could reveal hidden empires, for learning that narcissistic abuse sometimes pushed women toward financial independence they'd never known they possessed. Her millionaire ex-husband had tried to discard her for someone younger and more adaptable. Instead, he'd freed her to become the billionaire she'd always been. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the nursery she'd designed in her new penthouse apartment, a space that overlooked Central Park and filled with morning light, decorated in soft yellows and greens that spoke of growth and possibility rather than traditional gender expectations. Her daughter, Emma Chen, slept peacefully in her crib, tiny fingers curled around a silk blanket that had been a gift from the Blackstone Industries board of directors. "She's beautiful," Rebecca said softly from the doorway. Margaret's cousin had taken the adoption decision with more grace than Margaret had dared hope, immediately offering to serve as Emma's godmother and primary babysitter instead. "She has your determination already. Look at how she grips everything." Margaret smiled, watching her 3-week-old daughter sleep with the fierce concentration of someone already planning to conquer the world. Emma had been born on a Tuesday morning in June, arriving 2 weeks early with the impatience of a child who'd inherited her mother's drive for efficiency. "The pediatrician says she's remarkably alert for her age," Margaret said, adjusting Emma's blanket with the gentle precision of a new mother who was still amazed by the reality of her child. "Yesterday, she stared at the mobile for 20 minutes straight, like she was analyzing its mechanical components." "Future engineer. Future CEO," Margaret replied without hesitation. Rebecca laughed. "You're going to raise her to think she can do anything, aren't you? I'm going to raise her to know she can do anything. There's a difference." Margaret's phone buzzed quietly with a message from Sarah, her assistant at Blackstone Industries. Even on maternity leave, Margaret remained connected to the company that had become her life's work. The message was brief but significant. Morrison integration complete ahead of schedule. West Coast offices reporting record client retention. Stock up 4% today. Margaret had been back to the office twice since Emma's birth, bringing the baby with her in a carrier that had become a familiar sight in boardrooms and conference calls. Far from being a distraction, Emma's presence had actually enhanced Margaret's reputation as a leader who'd successfully integrated all aspects of her life into a coherent whole. "The Wall Street Journal called again," Rebecca said, settling into the rocking chair beside Emma's crib. "They want to interview you about balancing motherhood with running a Fortune 500 company." "What did you tell them? That you don't balance anything, You integrate everything into a life that works for you rather than trying to fit yourself into someone else's definition of success. Margaret nodded approvingly. Rebecca had become invaluable as both family support and media liaison, handling the constant stream of interview requests and speaking invitations that had followed Margaret's transformation from discarded wife to corporate powerhouse. The apartment intercom buzzed, announcing David Martinez's arrival for their weekly business meeting. Margaret had structured her maternity leave as a working sabbatical, 6 weeks of modified responsibilities, rather than complete absence from corporate decision-making. "Send him up," Margaret said into the intercom, "and ask him to bring coffee. The good kind from that place on Madison." David arrived with a briefcase full of documents and a bag of pastries from Margaret's favorite bakery. At 53, he'd become more than just her lawyer. He was her closest advisor and one of the few people who'd witnessed her complete transformation from supporting spouse to independent powerhouse. "How's our future CEO?" David asked, peering into Emma's crib with the affection of an honorary uncle. "Sleeping like someone who already owns the world," Margaret replied. "What's the status on the European expansion?" David settled into the living room that Margaret had designed as a combination nursery monitoring station and home office. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided natural light for both business meetings and baby care, while custom furniture allowed for seamless transitions between corporate calls and feeding schedules. "London and Frankfurt offices are ready to open in September," David reported. "We've hired management teams that specialize in international consulting, and the client pipeline is already robust." Margaret reviewed the expansion documents while Emma slept in her carrier beside the coffee table. The European expansion represented the final phase of Margaret's strategic plan to transform Blackstone Industries from a regional consulting firm into a global corporation that specialized in supporting women-owned businesses and midlife career transitions. "The Women Entrepreneurs Fund has received applications from 12 countries," David continued. "We're going to need a much larger staff if we want to maintain personal review of every proposal." "Hire them," Margaret said without hesitation. "I want every woman over 40 who has a viable business plan to have access to capital and mentorship. Money is only useful if you're actually improving the world with it." David made notes in his leather portfolio, the same one he'd carried to every meeting since Margaret's first desperate phone call about Richard's divorce announcement. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal?" "Always." "Do you ever miss it? The simplicity of being someone's wife instead of being responsible for thousands of employees and billions of dollars in revenue." Margaret considered the question while watching Emma sleep, thinking about the life she'd been living a year ago, when her biggest decision was which charity gala dress to wear, and her greatest accomplishment was supporting someone else's dreams. "I miss the illusion of simplicity," she said finally, "but I don't miss being half of myself. For 22 years, I was Margaret Blackstone, Richard's wife, instead of Margaret Chen, my own person. I didn't realize how exhausting it was to live as someone's appendage until I finally got to be whole." Emma stirred in her carrier, making the soft sounds that indicated she was waking up and would soon demand attention with the authority of someone accustomed to having her needs met immediately. "She's going to grow up thinking it's normal for women to own companies," David observed. "She's going to grow up knowing that women supporting women isn't just a nice idea. It's a business strategy that works." Margaret lifted Emma from her carrier, settling into the feeding routine that had become as natural as reviewing quarterly reports. The baby latched on immediately, staring up at her mother with dark eyes that seemed to hold infinite possibility. "There's something else," David said, his voice carrying a note of excitement that cut through the peaceful domesticity of the moment. "Richard called my office yesterday." Margaret looked up from feeding Emma, surprised by the mention of her ex-husband. "Richard? What did he want?" "He wanted to know if you'd be interested in hiring him as a consultant for the European expansion. Apparently, he has contacts in London that could be useful for the new offices." Margaret laughed, the sound echoing through the sun-filled apartment. "He wants to work for me. Essentially, yes. He's struggling financially. His consulting firm in New Jersey isn't working out, and he needs the income. He thought his European business connections might be valuable to Blackstone Industries." The irony was breathtaking. A year ago, Richard had thrown her out of their home because he thought she wasn't ambitious enough to keep up with his lifestyle. Now he was asking to work for the company that had always belonged to her. What did you tell him? That I'd present the proposal to you and let you decide? Emma finished feeding and dozed against Margaret's shoulder, her tiny body warm and solid with the promise of a future that would be entirely different from her mother's past. Margaret walked to the windows overlooking Central Park, watching families push strollers along paths where she'd once walked as Richard's wife, dreaming of a different life without realizing she already had everything she needed to create it. Set up a meeting, Margaret said finally, but make it clear that he'd be working as a junior consultant, not a partner. And David, I want the contract to include a clause about professional conduct and respect for corporate hierarchy. You're going to hire him. I'm going to give him the opportunity to learn what it's like to work for someone who actually earned their position. Margaret replied, Richard spent 23 years thinking he'd built an empire. Maybe it's time he discovered what it takes to be a valuable employee in someone else's company. As David gathered his papers and prepared to leave, Margaret remained at the window with Emma sleeping in her arms. Below them, the city continued its endless rhythm of ambition and achievement. Millions of people building their own versions of success while she held the future in her arms. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda. Saw the Forbes article about you being named CEO of the Year. Mom is telling everyone at the grocery store that her daughter owns a billion-dollar company. We're all so proud. Margaret smiled and typed back one-handed, Tell Mom that Emma is going to inherit a very different world than the one we grew up in. As evening approached, Margaret fed Emma again and began preparing for bedtime, both the baby's and her own. Tomorrow would bring another day of conference calls and contract negotiations, of building an empire that prioritized supporting others over accumulating power, of raising a daughter who would grow up believing that anything was possible because her mother had proven it was true. Margaret Chen had spent the first 45 years of her life learning to be what other people needed her to be. The rest of her life would be dedicated to showing Emma and every other woman who'd been told to be grateful for less than she deserved what was possible when you finally decided to claim everything you'd actually earned. It had been an extraordinary year for discovering that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the push you needed toward your real life. Her millionaire ex-husband had tried to discard her for someone younger and more adaptable. Instead, he'd freed her to become the woman she'd always been, underneath the expectations and limitations everyone else had imposed on her. Margaret Chen, mother, CEO, and living proof that women supporting women wasn't just a motto, it was a revolution, one successful business at a time.